Is the Canon EOS R5 still a good camera for purchasing in 2023? Or would you be better off purchasing the Sony a7R5 or even the Nikon Z9? Details coming up, but first, I encourage you to subscribe and choose all notifications so you can stay up to date on all the latest camera gear, news, and rumors. I got my Canon EOS R5 in 2020. 1 week before it was released to the public, Canon gave me a call in the morning saying, hey, we've got an R5 for you if you'd like to try it out for the weekend. Well, I was in the hospital, I was just recovering from surgery, and I was a little bit delirious, and I said, yeah, let me get back to you on that. I just had surgery. It didn't take very long before I figured out, what am I doing? Of course I'm gonna say yes. So I called Canon back up, said, yeah, I'd love to have the camera, and I was able to play around with it for a whole week before I ended up purchasing it, and I've been shooting with it every day since. I've shot well over 600 videos for this channel alone, and in my personal business, I've shot over 3 films, over 72 minutes long. I've shot a lot of video with this camera, obviously, but I've also used the stills capabilities. So here we are as we're about to move into 2023, 2.5 years after Canon announced and released the Canon EOS R5. Is it still a good bargain? Is it still worth spending $3,900? Well, that's the main question I'm going to ask in this video. First of all, let's take a look at some of the key capabilities, the outcomes that we expect from investing into this camera and into the Canon camera platform. The Canon R5 has a 45 megapixel full frame sensor. 45 megapixels is still quite a bit today. There are very few cameras that can go well past this. One of them being the Sony recently announced Sony a7R5, which can shoot at 61 megapixels. And yes, I know the a7R4 could shoot at 61 megapixels as well, but still 45 megapixels is a lot of data. It's a lot of information. And if you're shooting at about 20 frames per second lossless RAW, well, that's in excess of 1.2 gigabytes per second. So you're dealing with a whole lot of information. And yes, there are cameras that can shoot for more than that, such as 40 frames per second, 30 frames per second, but there are certain caveats on the buffer and other things that basically limit you to about a second of shooting. And since we're talking about still shooting on the Canon EOS R5, you can shoot 12 frames per second mechanical. But if we switch over to electronic, you can get 20 frames per second. And if you've got the right media inside your camera, well, you can shoot for well in excess of 20 seconds. 20 seconds is as far as I've gone in my testing with Angelbird CF Express cards, the AV Pro Mark IIs, where they have a minimum sustained write speed of 1.48 gigabytes per second. So I held down the shutter button in electronic mode, 45 megapixels large, and it was pretty impressive. I went to 20 seconds before I stopped. I just couldn't believe how long I can get. So as far as continuous shooting goes on the Canon EOS R5, 12 frames per second mechanical and 20 frames per second electronic, it certainly didn't feel like this camera was letting me down in any way whatsoever. However, if you are going to be getting into sports, and that's primarily sports photography or any sort of fast action photography, motorsports, then I'd seriously take a look at the Canon EOS R3 or the 1DX Mark III. The R3 being the more recent camera and the 1DX Mark III, well, that came out about 6 months for the Canon EOS R5 and is the last of the DSLRs. But that 45 megapixel sensor isn't just for stills alone. It allows us to shoot 8K video, DCI, and UHD up to 30 frames per second. And even today, November 2022, as we embark on 2023, there are very few cameras that allow us to do 8K video, but a whole lot more than when the Canon EOS R5 came out, which, well, there was just one. Well, unless you were willing to spend something like $28,000+ for a cinema camera. So there are other cameras that can do 8K video, but if you're looking at 8K RAW video up to 30 frames per second, well, the Sony Alpha 1 doesn't do that, the Sony a7R5 doesn't do that, but the Nikon Z9 does, although it costs a little bit more. And the recently announced Canon EOS R3, well, it tops out at 6K at 60 frames per second. So if you're looking at shooting 8K RAW, well, there's really only 2 cameras for you. That's the Canon EOS R5 at $3,900, and of course, the Nikon Z9 at $5,500. However, that brings a few more options to you. And if you're looking at IPB, well, then now you can start looking at the Sony Alpha 1, which does provide 8.6K oversampled 8K. But to have 8K RAW at up to 30 frames per second, that's still an impressive feat here in 2022 as we move into 2023. And of course, that 8K allows you to give full sensor readout to 4K as well, giving you 8K oversample 4K, providing really detailed video. And I've been shooting an awful lot. It's amazing the amount of shooting I've been doing with this camera. And yes, these video shots here, they're pretty boring. And most of the times I'm just shooting 8-bit. But when I'm out shooting run and gun stuff and some of the scenery that I see, being able to capture that in 8K over sample 4K really makes a huge difference. And by shooting in Canon Log 3, which is what I've been shooting for the past couple of years, since Canon released a firmware update supporting Canon Log 3, it's all I've been shooting in. I get so much more dynamic range, better low light performance, and it just makes my video look that much better. If I try shooting in 8-bit other than this studio piece right here, or instead of doing Astro stuff, I just find that 8-bit looks too flat. It looks, well, like it was shot 4 or 5 years ago. Shooting in log, while it takes a little bit of effort to learn, the benefits are just absolutely amazing. So we're talking about 8K video, 8K over sample, 4K video. We're talking about frame rates and codecs that just make for very, very large files. If you're shooting 8K RAW at 30 frames per second, it's 325 megabytes per second, not bits. That's an awful lot of data. And if you're shooting 8K over sample 4K, I think it's somewhere around 80 to 125 megabytes per second. It's 470 megabits per second, so that's probably around 75-ish. Still, it's a lot of data. When the R5 first came out and I looked at getting this camera, I made a few comments on this channel, which you can probably find today, where I said, nobody really needs CF Express. I wish it had dual UHS 2 card slots. And yeah, you know what? As soon as I got the camera, I recanted that. What I can say now is having CF Express Type B card slot makes a huge difference. You can certainly record 8K over sample 4K using the Canon EOS R5 to basically V30 cards, and it will work. And if you're just shooting 10-second, 30-second, 40-second clips, you're going to be fine. But if you start shooting 10-minute segments, 30 minutes, 50 minutes, or even 60-minute segments, you're going to start to run into trouble. It's going to take you well over 30 minutes to start copying your content off. Whereas a CF Express card, well, they provide an order of magnitude in terms of moving content, both capturing it onto the card and then allowing you to copy it off. I've got several Angelbird cards that I can use for shooting, ones that are more designed for photographers, giving a minimum sustained write speed of 1.48 gigabytes per second, and one designed for video that will give you 1.3 gigabytes per second. I mean, both are really, really fast, more than capable of handling 8K video up to 30, well, even 60, or even doing 8K up to 120 frames per second if the Canon R5 was so able to do so. The Red V Raptor can do 8K 120, and I think it's right around 850 megabytes per second sustained. So 1300 megabytes per second. What that essentially means is you can edit off these cards, and I do. I have the 4 terabyte, and I'm editing a film right now that's 72 minutes long, and I'm editing off this card. It's so much faster, more reliable and durable than the standard SD cards, or sorry, the SSDs that I have, which top out at around 500 to 550 megabytes per second. So 1300 megabytes per second is, I can edit off of these things, but when it comes to removing content off of it, well, they peak somewhere around 1.7 gigabytes per second. So I'm able to move content off a whole lot quicker. But because of their speeds are high enough, one thing I'm able to do is I'm using the Ninja 5 for this camera right now, the R5, and I've got an AtomX SSD on the end of it. All I do, once I'm finished filming, I take that, plug it into the computer, and I edit right off of that. I don't have to transcode. I don't have to move it. It's being captured in Apple ProRes 422 using the Ninja 5, which works out really, really well. However, when I'm out shooting my run and gun stuff, I'm using the CF Express card. I might have anywhere from, well, 70 clips to a couple of 100 clips. I bring them into the computer. I do a batch, compress, and convert everything over to Apple ProRes 422. And yeah, I just love that CF Express card. I only wish that the Canon EOS R5 had 2 or dual CF Express Type B card slots. The Canon EOS R5 does shoot at 10-bit 422. I kind of covered that already when I talked about Canon Log 3. The R5 has Canon Log 1 and with a firmware update provided Canon Log 3. And that's the only way to actually get 10-bit 422 with the R5. You can't actually choose 10-bit 422. You just have to choose Canon Log 1 or Canon Log 3. If you turn Canon Log off, you're shooting 8-bit 420. So for 10-bit 422, Canon Log 1 or Canon Log 3. The Canon EOS R5 was the 3rd camera that Canon released for the RF mount. We had the Canon EOS R announced in 2018, and then the Canon EOS RP announced in January of the following year. We had to wait all the way until the middle of 2020 before we got the R5, and the R6. So at the time that both of these cameras were announced, there really weren't a whole lot of lenses. In fact, back then, if you didn't buy the Canon EOS R5 with the EF to RF adapter, well, you didn't have too many lenses to choose from, and most of the lenses out at the time, other than the 24-105, were very expensive, such as the Canon the Canon RF 50mm f1.2. But what this adapter does, it allows you to take any EF or EFS lens and put it on your R5. So that can be some 107 lenses that Canon's released since the mid-80s, or it can be any other third-party lens by Tamron, Sigma, or anybody else. Can be adapted to the R5. I've been using the adapter for the past couple of years, haven't had any issues with it. So if you're still looking at the R5, wondering if there's enough lenses out there, well, what you have to do is figure out what focal lengths you want, what apertures, whether you want fast lenses, whether you want telephotos, zooms, super telephotos, tilt shift, whatever it is you want. Take a look and see what's out there for the RF mount, take a look at what's out there for the EF mount. And while Canon's discontinued or stopped making a lot of the lenses, because there's so many of these lenses out there, there's a huge and vast, very healthy used market for EF glass. And like I said, you can also adapt. This is the 18-135 USM. You can adapt EFS glass as well, but there are some caveats. Don't bank on EFS glass because you lose that 8K oversample 4K, and it basically is stuck in cropped mode the whole time. But EF glass, for the first year of shooting this channel with the R5, well, I think it was more like 6 months. I was shooting with a Canon EF, not RF, EF 50mm f1.2, and I wish I hadn't have sold it and bought the RF version. While the RF is sharper and better, the focus motor is a little louder, and when it comes to video, I wish I had kept the EF version. So if I can catch a sale on the EF, I'll pick that one up for sure. The Canon EOS R5 has IBIS, but it's nowhere near as good or capable as what you would find in a Micro Four Thirds camera, like the Panasonic GH5 or the GH6. That Micro Four Thirds sensor is a whole lot smaller, so those cameras are able to move it around a whole lot easier without any issue. So with the Canon EOS R5, I tried shooting with IBIS, I took it out, and if I'm standing still, it's great for video. The IBIS designed on the R5, it's really designed with photographers in mind, allowing them to shoot for longer as the sun starts to set. As you start to go into poor low light situations, you can shoot with a larger, or with opening up the shutter for a little bit longer without having to worry about blur. But when it comes to video, if you really want that cinematic smooth video, IBIS isn't going to really do it for you. If you're standing still, yes. If you're acting as a tripod, yes. But if you really want that cinematic smooth video, you're going to just have to go ahead and get yourself a gimbal. I use the Crane 2S. You can use many other gimbals out there, but that's the only way to really get that smooth cinematic video, whether you're walking, running, on a bicycle, in a car. IBIS is on a full frame camera. You can't expect it to work miracles. The Canon EOS R5 is weather sealed, and so are most of the lenses. If you're buying an L series lens, it's weather sealed. The R5 is weather sealed. However, if you adapt some older lenses that aren't weather sealed, or if you buy some of the glass for the RF mount that isn't, doesn't matter how weather sealed your camera is. If you're out shooting Niagara Falls, that mist is going to get inside your camera and you risk damaging your camera. So my recommendation, if you're going to spend the money, invest $3,900 US into the R5, invest in L series glass if you're planning to be outside, out and about, doing run and gun stuff where you don't know about the weather. I've shot in all sorts of conditions from -20 all the way up to about 35 degrees Celsius, which is somewhere, I think, around like -4 Fahrenheit, all the way up to almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And I've never had a problem with a camera. No problems whatsoever. I'll talk about overheating in just a moment. I haven't forgotten about that. But in terms of various conditions I've operated in, and when I was shooting just a couple of months ago this summer, and I was shooting in 80-degree temperatures outside, I didn't have any fans. It was just a light ambient breeze. Didn't have any problems with the camera, and I was able to shoot endlessly. So weather sealing is really, really important in the lens of the camera. I've shot in rain, I've shot in snow, I've shot in all sorts of conditions, and like I said, 2.5 years, and the camera, as you can see right here, keeps on going. I get it, the Canon EOS R5 isn't cheap at $3,900, especially as we look at what might be coming out in 2023 and 2024. We're definitely past that halfway mark for a refresh. I don't think we're going to see a refresh in 2023. We'll probably see the Canon EOS R1 before we see a refresh of the R5 Mark II. But first, let's address the elephants in the room. Well, not the literal ones, but the, well, figurative ones. Back in 2020, when this camera came out, I broke a story about overheating in the Canon EOS R5. I'd picked up something Peter McKinnon had said when he was shooting, that the camera overheated while he was filming. I thought, that's strange. It looks like he's up north. His camera's overheating? Well, I got some flack for that, but as soon as I got the camera, yes, it was overheating. In fact, if you played around with a camera, not even shot any stills or video, and then you switched over to video mode, sometimes you might only have 5 or 10 minutes of recording left. And if you put the camera in a fridge, it didn't help. You could shoot with the camera in a fridge and it would still overheat, almost as though that overheating was based on a timer and not the actual ambient temperature. Well, Canon very quickly rushed out firmware 1.1 to the market, and now what we have with the camera is that when you were shooting in cooler temperatures, it would take into account the ambient temperature. So for me or others shooting in cold climates, Canon EOS R5 overheating isn't an issue for 8 to 10 months of the year, like right now in November where it's, a nice toasty 5 degrees Celsius. But anybody in 2020 and 2021 who asked if they should get the Canon EOS R5 for video, if they lived in the tropics or subtropics, places like Florida or Malaysia, I said, no, don't get the R5. There are better cameras. The R5 is going to overheat. It's not reliable and trustworthy in terms of that timing. However, not too long ago, earlier this year, Canon released firmware 1.6 and it got a new overheat or heat management mode in it. And it was impressive. At first, I wasn't all that impressed. I thought, well, I'll test this out. I did a video on what was in the firmware update, but I didn't really believe that we could see such a huge change. Well, I did some testing. At 70 degrees, I could shoot 8K RAW at 30 frames per second, unlimited. I got up to about 2.5 hours and finally turned it off. There was no sign of even an overheat warning. So I thought, well, okay, let's try 8K oversample 4K. No overheating. I did try 4K 120. It was the only mode that would still cause overheating, but it took me pressing the record button 3 times because it times out after 7.5 minutes. Yes, we still have record limits on the Canon EOS R5. Yes, Canon's removed it from the R7, the R10, the R3, and the just announced Canon EOS R6 Mark II. But in terms of overheating, that's what we're talking about right here. If you download firmware 1.6 and apply it to the Canon EOS R5, not only can you record at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, but also 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I did extensive testing here, and that's around 27 degrees Celsius. Then the Def Director tested in Texas heat at 96 degrees Fahrenheit, and he didn't get any overheating either in 8K oversample 4K or 8K RAW, and that's truly impressive. So the Canon EOS R5 now, as a video camera, is very, very comparable. You're getting 8K RAW video, 8K oversample 4K, 4K 60, although 4K 60 doesn't get that full sensor readout. You're really getting that high detail up to 30 frames per second, and then things soften quite a bit. 4K 120, they soften even further. And then, of course, you've got a lot of detail in 8K RAW. So a truly incredible camera when it comes to video. And of course, the bread and butter for this camera has been as a stills camera for photographers doing fashion, for doing portraits, for doing landscapes, for pretty well doing everything. The R5 is in a way what the 5 series has always been, kind of the master of everything. It does a little bit of every scenario. While it can do fast action and sports with 20 frames per second, I wouldn't say that it's better than the R3 or the 1DX Mark III. They have faster buffers, they can shoot for longer, and they have a reduced rolling shutter. And while the Canon EOS R5 does have rolling shutter, it's not anything significant. Yes, most cameras, unless they have a global shutter, are going to have some degree of rolling shutter. But if you know anybody who's in the cinema, whether in Hollywood, whether in your country of origin, in Canada, in the Canadian film industry, you're going to see there's going to be some degree of rolling shutter. It's not a bad thing. It's only when things become really wobbly and really bad, such as the Canon EOS R, that rolling shutter's a problem. But what other problems did I have with the Canon EOS R5? So the overheat was fixed in firmware update, which is free, and we got Canon Log 3 in the firmware update, but there are other annoyances. That 30-minute record limit, again, I keep bringing it up because, like a broken record, it's not going away. The Canon EOS R5, a $3,900 camera, released back in 2020. We've gotten over 10 firmware updates, and that timed limit, that 30-minute record limit that has no basis today for being there, is still there when we can buy a $979 Canon EOS R10 and it has no record limit. So that's annoying, but I don't think it's going to go away. Canon had indicated it was going to go away, but I think we're going to have to wait for the Canon EOS R5 Mark II to see that 30-minute limit go away. In terms of video, other things I would like to see, I'd like to see Apple ProRes as a video capture mode, a video capture codec. That would be really handy. We've seen it in other cameras, and including the R6 Mark II over HDMI output. And I don't like to talk about HDMI output too much because when I'm out doing run and gun stuff, I don't use the Ninja 5. I want to go lightweight. I want to do CF Express for storage. I don't want to go with an external recorder. I even don't want to shoot with gimbals. I want to go with a camera, go out there with just the lens hood, the lens, and the camera itself and shoot. So what I'm looking for, what I really want to see is Apple ProRes 422 internal. And then if they want to give us Apple ProRes RAW, yes, I can understand making that an external over HDMI. But Apple ProRes 422 internal, there's no reason that can't happen. My Ninja 5, after all, can do it, not the Ninja 5 Plus, but I get Apple ProRes 422. And there are other cameras out there, I think the GH6 that does Apple ProRes 2.2 internal. Would really love to see that on the Canon EOS R5, really would. That would really help with editing. But if it was one of those codecs that was provided over HDMI, I probably wouldn't use it nearly as much. And if we got that, well, there wouldn't be much use for using a Ninja 5 anymore, would there? Yeah, of course there is. The main reason I'm using the Ninja 5 is not for that 30-minute record limit, although that's a big deal. It's the exposure tools that we get. False color, waveforms, vector scopes, all those things really help us on a much larger screen. So right above the lens, I can see myself. I can see that I'm recording. I've got that big rectangular, because the R5 doesn't give you any tele lights. So I can see that I'm recording. I've got all those waveforms and vector scopes. And one of the nice things about the waveforms, and I know the R5C has it, and some of other Canon's cameras like the R6 Mark II has false color. But waveforms on the Ninja 5, they're color waveforms. So if I'm wearing a hat sitting under a tree, there's a lot of other stuff beside me, and I move side to side, I can tell exactly where my IRE is. With a monochrome, I can't tell if I can see a spike going up to almost 100 IRE, but because I'm wearing a hat, there's other things above me, I can't tell if that's me. But with color waveforms, it's so easy to tell if it's me, and I just love that about the Ninja 5 and the Ninja 5 Plus. It's a great tool. So yes, it helps get around that 30-minute record limit. For this video here, which I'm at what, how long now? Oh, good Lord. No, is that 50 minutes or 30 minutes? Let's put the glasses on proper. 30 minutes, good. I was getting worried if this was 50 minutes. I wasn't trying to make a long video here. I'm trying to make this short, sweet, and to the point, something that you can enjoy on your break or your lunchtime. But yeah, pretty impressive camera. I have to say that if you're a photographer or if you're shooting video, I think that the Canon EOS R5 with firmware 1.6, there are very few cameras here as we embark on 2023 that gives us the same level of capabilities. And one other thing I would like to see the Canon EOS R5 do in the video modes is give us evaluative, partial, spot, metering. In the R5, in video modes, we don't get any choice. And one other thing I would like to see too, as certainly as an option, is when we're using eye autofocus, whatever the focus point is locked in onto, have it auto expose for that. Sony does that, and it really, really helps us, especially for us doing one-man shows when we're outside, if there's a change in light patterns. I love how the Sony just ever so slightly changes the grading, changes the lighting where you don't notice it. And I'd love to see that on the Canon EOS R5 Mark II. So some metering modes, and of course, autofocus or auto exposure to the autofocus point when using eye detection or face detection. That would go a long way. So what about the Canon EOS R5 in 2023? Should you get the Sony A7 R5, the Nikon Z9, or any other camera? Well, if you own Canon gear, if you own Canon lenses, I'd say that buying the Canon EOS R5 today is a no-brainer. Compared to other cameras out there, very few give you 8K video, let alone 8K RAW. Allow you to shoot Canon Log 3, Canon Log 1, so log profiles with high bit rates, 325 megabytes per second for 8K, about 75 for 4K, really good resolution, and of course, as a very, very solid stills camera that works for pretty well any genre. Portrait, landscapes, you name it, it can do it really, really well. I think that it's a great professional level camera, and the one thing that we're seeing as a benefit, this camera came out 2.5 years ago, and I don't see the need to refresh it anytime soon. I think it stands alone by itself. Other than that record limit in video, I think it's a very, very solid camera aimed at professionals. So while I think the Sony a7 R5 is a terrific camera, if you currently have Canon gear, I don't see the need to switch camps. And if you own Nikon gear, well, I'd look at the Nikon Z9. And if you own Sony gear, well, take a look at that a7 R5 because it does have a lot of nice capabilities. Although when it comes to 8K RAW, it doesn't give you that. There are some caveats to some of the video shooting modes, but it's still a very good stills camera. And we're still waiting for the Sony A9 Mark III, which should fill in some of the gaps between the Alpha 1 and the a7 R5. And of course, you've got that Alpha 1 as well. It does do 8K video, 8.6K oversampled 8K, but it doesn't do RAW. But thank you so much for watching. That's it for now. If you want to stay up to date on all the latest camera gear, news and rumors, or reviews like this, please go ahead and click that subscribe button, followed by choosing all notifications. By choosing all notifications, as soon as I publish a new video like this one here, well, you'll get notified by YouTube, so that way you can stay up to date on all the latest camera news and rumors. It saves you from scrubbing all the Twitter feeds, RSS feeds, your favorite websites, your favorite photography magazines, YouTube channels, and, well, the list goes on. Essentially, if time matters to you, I cover off all the major sites, all in one spot, all the major brands, all the major models, news, rumors, and reviews, all here in one place. So please subscribe and choose all notifications. That's it for now. Have yourself a great week, and we'll see you again soon.